podium and address council.
Melissa Gonzalez, 26 Reese. I wanted to address the item about the committee restructuring. I want to do it now because it may be a done deal, and I'm not going to lay down in the tracks over it. But I don't really get what advantage we would get to moving planning and the name change from planning and environmental. And the reason that I think about this is that one of the reasons that people wanted to do this was about the LDC. But we're going to have a separate committee for the LDC way. So and say, well, it's the way everybody else does it. But I don't know that Sunset Valley wants to do it the way that everybody else does it. One of the things that makes Sunset Valley what it is how environmental we are. And if those people keep an eye on that, and it's a really different skill set. If you go into a zoning committee meeting, people say, this is the case in front of us. And they're very good about saying this is the case in front of us and addressing it. It's a very legal, but it isn't a big picture kind of thing. And I just really feel like, I'm not going to fight this, whatever, but I would say, I think there's a loss there to such an environmental city where everything we look at kind of looks that way. And if it's a case of not wanting to take it between two committees, half the time, neither one of them want the long things, and it's going to be an ad hoc committee. So I just don't know what we gain. So that's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, 1, 2, 3. So I'm here tonight to offer a constructive pathway forward that addresses both environmental goals and the basic fairness for the villa's neighborhood. First, let's just be consistent. Just across the city limit, Austin allows 45% impervious cover on single-family lots under a quarter acre. That's SF3 standard in their land development code. Our PUD caps many villas lots, forcing families into costly variances or zoning amendments, while some properties already sit well above 50% impervious cover because records were lost and the developer didn't meet his obligations. Second, an as-built lot-by-lot survey of the 52 homes would cost over $100,000. It would only tell us that impervious cover exists. It would not capture runoff volume nor propose solutions. Rather than spend 6 figures measuring concrete that's already there, let's redirect that money into WaterWise mitigation. Increase the city WaterWise landscaping rebate pool to $25,000 so we can fund meaningful upgrades, rainwater harvesting, permeable pavers, and low flow irrigation on every lot, not just the first few applicants. Allow high quality synthetic turf as an eligible item. If the program's goal is water conservation, materials that achieve a reduction in irrigation should qualify regardless of whether they are native plants or modern turf or secondhand turf. Finally, make the rebate retroactive for projects completed since January 1st, 2023, so early adopters are not penalized for acting before a policy change. By realigning impervious cover limits with the surrounding jurisdiction and by funding practical water-saving retrofits instead of paperwork, Council can simultaneously respect homeowners, protect water quality, and end the cycle of one-off zoning battles. Thank you for your time and for considering these 3 concrete actions: equal impervious cover standards, a smarter use of funds, and an expanded retroactive WaterWise rebate.
Thank you. So council, as I think email went out to everyone, because we do still have an interest and a recommendation from zoning to bring back the PUD over at the villas for discussion and possible recommendations for, examination or what the process would be. And my intention is to bring that back on the June 3rd meeting. Hopefully we can pull everything together by that time before we go on our summer break, but that'll help us have this discussion and determine if council wants to make recommendations on how to proceed for revisiting or relooking at the PUD and what recommendations came out of staff and zoning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. My name is Burton Pearson, 39 Pillow Road. I came today to speak. Well, I'm also a member of the Planning and Environmental Committee, and I'm on the subcommittee for prairie restoration. I came to speak against the idea of moving planning to zoning. And the reason I'm doing that is I've got an incident here, example incident of what can occur if such a move might be made. First of all, I do want to say this move would probably be permanent. And right now we have a very ecological council, thanks to all of you. But in the future, we may not. And right now we have a relatively, and I think a pretty ecologically, as far as I know, zoning commission. But in the future, we may not. And so I think we need to have, I think as Melissa underlined here, people with a specific skill set, people who understand the environmental problems, people who are caught up on that and know about that, to weigh in at the first levels of planning. When NASA's going to build a spaceship, the capsule, they don't design that capsule and then go to the life support team and say, well, doesn't this look great? Well, the life support team's going to say, well, no, we have to rearrange this and that. We need room for this equipment. So it's not very efficient to have the life support team not in on the initial planning. And that's what P&E is, really. It's the life support team to try to help avoid ecological difficulties. Now, the example problem I had that I want to mention is that before our last P&E meeting, which was on May 8th, Council gave a directive to staff that we were only to consider the phasing of the current MN schematic. Now, our group has not weighed in on that schematic at all up to this point. So this council, which is one of the most tremendously ecological council, has restricted our abilities to make recommendations regarding the environment and even regarding parks, which is going to be part of our new name, Parks and Environment. Now, if you all, who are ecologically minded as you are, this situation can occur. You can imagine what's going to happen with a less ecologically concerned council and a less ecologically concerned zoning commission. Now, having an ad hoc committee, the problem with that is when you form that to give some opinions to the actual, let's say, code changes, you got 2 environmentalists and 4 other people who don't have to know anything about the environment. It seems fair because each committee has its own same amount of representation, but the problem is if you've got cancer, it might be fair to invite an oncologist and the person who's the head of your insurance team and the person who actually does the janitorial work and a midwife if they don't know what an oncologist is or don't understand the fact that you need somebody who knows what they're doing because of the crisis. Currently, our government is rolling back protections to save us from climate change, and therefore there's going to be even more pressure on open lands with dehydration and that kind of thing. So anyway, we were restricted into what we could do, and that surprised me tremendously. Now, that's basically what I have to say. And so I will say this, that for the future, let's put people who are dedicated in Sunset Valley to protecting the environment on the ground floor of planning. And then we can avoid things like what happened here on May 8th, I hope, okay? Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, really, really thank you all.
Thank you.
Mayor and members of the City Council, Russell Harding, 10 Pillow Road. I just want to take a few minutes to share some history of the city of Sunset Valley that I found. What happened was when I moved into my property on Pillow Road, 1976, the owner of the property handed me 2 packets of documents saying this was the history of the property. Well, I just moved in, so I didn't have time to look at them. I put them in a file cabinet in the back bedroom, and they sat there until last week when I was digging out files and everything. I started looking through them, and it was the most fascinating thing that I've seen. The very first document I saw was an abstract of title dated March 19, 1835, from the state of Coahuila in Texas to Theodore Bissell. That was before Texas was a state. That was Mexico granting this property to Theodore Bissell. There was just abstract after title. The transfer just went on and on and on. It was so fascinating to watch that. I have copies of this one that y'all might. I'll just mention a couple more because they're just so. The abstract of title dated May 6, 1896, from W.L. Stanford to James Brody, 200 acres of land for $8,650. And then from the Brodys, the Brody family, they had several children. There were many, many transfers of title there. I'll just do a couple more here. August 4th, 1947. Oh, wait, let me go back to 1947. There was a transfer of title to C.R. Flournoy. Of course, we know them. And that was, I don't know the amount of property, but it's for $12,000. And then in August of 1947, transfer from C.R. Flournoy to Anna Pillow, and that's where we got the name Pillow Road. And then finally, I'll just mention one thing. In April of 1947, there was an abstract of title. This was transferred from the landowners, Flournoy, Jones, Pillow, Reese, to the public. And I am assuming that they did that in contemplation of the formation of a city. So anyway, this was a fascinating document to look at. It's very fragile. I had a hard time even making that one copy, but anyway, it's a history of our city and the various transfers of title. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if any of that information is included in our city history guide, but this could supplement that, I think, with the next revision. So. Yeah, 3 years.
Oh, hi. Yeah. Sorry. Hello. It's on. Down. I'm Sarah Ponder, 1030 Sunflower. I have a few things to say, and I'm really glad I went last because I learned more about the committee merger. Is that what's happening? So now I have something to say about that. So a few things. First, again, I just want to say thank you to the council and the staff on a number of things. Recently, we got to go to Art Fest, which was really great, and we got to go to the building hammer thing. That was also really nice, and I'm very excited about the backyard and the Upper Cougar Creek trails and all of those things that are happening. So thank you to everybody who's working on that. I also wanted to provide a bit of context. I was on the P&E committee about 5 years ago for 1 year. I think it was the 2019-ish year, maybe 2020, I don't remember. And I was only on it for 1 year because I'll be honest, it felt a little too slow for my liking. And while I know I very much appreciate history, I very much appreciate our environment, I vote on all of those things to preserve all of those things in my life. I also remember that it was that year that I was on the committee that we had, I think it was like this, at that point, at least the second go-round of considerations of what to do with Upper Cougar Creek and these other spaces. And now it's happening, and it was 5 years ago. And I've since had at least one child since then, and we've done a lot since then. And so I'll just note that we're probably going to be living here, given our age, for probably 30 more years. And so anything that the city can do to make processes that do impact our lives more efficient would be great. So I'm in favor of anything that does that, as long as it stays transparent and lets people participate as they wish. So that's that topic. Next topic is, as Ross said, we did remove our zoning variance. I'm gonna call it a variance because that's really probably what it should have been. And we removed it because, again, we didn't think that a zoning amendment was the right process in the first place. But I wanted to point out that if you're not already familiar, as Ross said, the surrounding cities zone quarter-acre lots or less, which is 100% of the villas, and does not apply, I think, to virtually any other part of Sunset Valley. Most of the villas, of the 52 or so houses, almost all of them have 40% or more impervious cover. I think save maybe 6 or 7. We are one of those 6 or 7, so we are under 40% currently. The city of Austin, I believe, allows about 45% for lots under a quarter acre. And so it has been suggested that the city do an as-built survey. While I think that that makes logical sense, I think practically that's probably extremely expensive. And I'm assuming it would have to involve I assume it would have to, all 52 of us would have to say, yes, you can come on my property and do a survey, which I imagine there's going to be at least a handful of folks who are not going to want that. And so is one, just look at the surrounding cities that are zoning in line with that. So if it's 40%, 45%, if it's 50%, if it's as-built plus the exemptions that we already allow, anything like that that's just honestly normal and reasonable, I think is the best path. And I want to leave with a couple of numbers just to put a finer point on the request, the variance that we made. The request that we made was for 0.0006% adding to the impervious cover in the PUD. And if you had given that 700 feet to all 52 homeowners, of which it's literally not even possible for all 52 homeowners to add 700 square feet because of the layout of their homes, you would still only be adding a fraction of 1% to the PUD. So we all spent a lot of time on this and a lot of staff hours and a lot of volunteer hours on this, and that just seems kind of crazy. My final thought is that I do think that we should take a good look at expanding the materials that are allowed for water-wise landscaping and making sure that the incentive, the monetary incentive, is increased to a point that is more incentivizing to more homeowners, particularly because costs keep going up. $15,000 sounds like a lot. It's not really that much when you're looking at, decent sized lots and the budgets that we have. So we think, I had turf at our last house. It worked really great. it didn't require any water as long as it's, you know, installed properly. So we should have maybe an expert come talk about that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak at this time? Well, thank you to all the members of the public that addressed council. We're going to be moving on to our next agenda item, which is consideration of agenda items for approval on consent. We have 2 items that are listed for consent tonight. Councilmember Rosengarten.
I move to approve on consent agenda item number 4, minutes of April 15th with a minor correction and May 6th minutes.
Okay, there's a motion to approve on consent number 4. Does anybody want to pull that item? And have the edits been submitted? Okay. All right. Is there a second for the motion to approve on consent item number 4? Mayor Pro Tem seconds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. All right, we approved on consent the minutes of the April 15th, 2025 meeting with these submitted edits and the May 6th, 2025 regular meeting. All right, we'll move on to item number 5, consider an act on approval of an amendment to Freeland Turk's task order number 26 for the Brody Lane filter box modification project. And let's go ahead and hand this over to Public Works for an introduction of this item before we begin council discussion.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. This is the continuation of, we kind of refer to these as the hazmat traps on Brody Lane, but they're filter boxes that are on Brody Lane. We did a feasibility study to see if it was possible to lower the lids and looking at the structural stability of those existing filter boxes. We've determined that we cannot lower the lids because by today, the amount of cap compliance with today's regulations, and we would have to actually rebuild the boxes to a newer technology. However, those lids are unsafe. When we were cleaning them about 5 years ago, it was obvious that they were not going to be able to be removed. They're also incredibly difficult to remove. And the filter boxes do require routine maintenance. We do need to go in and we need to kind of vacuum them out, clean them, replace some of the medium material that's inside of it, and get them so that they're operational and that we're protecting water quality along Brody Lane with the existing infrastructure that we do have. Additionally, it was determined that there was an underutilization of one of the filter boxes, and we could actually use a pipe between the two to equalize that so that they are both utilized more effectively. And all of these things can be done under basically as maintenance, and that does not trigger any additional compliance. And so is to replace those lids, to put in newer lids that either are going to have a manhole access or possibly a metal, like a steel lid that can be removed quite easily. And also the package and get ready for the cleaning of the filter boxes and the replacement of the media as needed. So the original task order for the feasibility was for $20,000. This amendment is for $97,000. That includes $67,850 for the structural engineering for lids for all the 5 boxes that need to be done. This is an engineering total of $118,200. So the idea would be to complete the engineering part here in FY25, and then we'd have a new project to actually send out for bids and get the lids redone and the boxes cleaned in the next fiscal year. Additionally, one of the things I said on here is that, you know, we should consider that in a future CIP, not in this next year, or maybe not in the next even 5 years, looking at ways we can improve water quality along Brody Lane as a long-term goal, and just to get those, you know, to upgrade that capture volume and things like that along Brody, and see how we can incorporate that into other projects we may be doing along the area. However, that long-term goal doesn't, you know, necessarily mean that us needing to clean the boxes and improve the safety of the lids for removal. We need to be able to still have those things there. So this is an important project for us to get done and move forward. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Councilor Rosengart?
That was one of the things I was wondering about, is if the future was going to be a project that was going to be replacing all of it, that's going to be very expensive.
It will be very expensive, but we can maintain the current things right now and keep them going, and then put it in as part of a discussion for, you know, so many years down the road that we would be looking at some kind of new infrastructure. Those boxes haven't been cleaned in 5 years, so they do need to be cleaned. And we do need to be able to safely access them to do that work.
And I know that I brought it up once before, is because there's a whole line of people trying to make a turn into the retail towards the Homestead section. So I mentioned, what about lowering the hazmat covers so
Right.
that you could extend the turning lane longer? And now we found out we can't do that.
Yeah, there's just not the treatment volume, and just even by today's standards, they just don't, they wouldn't be acceptable. And so we can't do any kind of retrofitting. I think we were able to get away with it probably 10, 15 years ago because there was one that was lowered, but it's just, we can't do that now.
The covers are going to be in-place concrete with a man lift. So I'm thinking a man lift is a metal cover with
Like a manhole.
in-place, a manhole.
Yeah.
But you're doing concrete in place. Now, how do you get that concrete attached to the filter underground?
It doesn't attach to the filter. It's a
It
big
doesn't.
empty space underneath it. So they're, those boxes are like basically like concrete, and then it's an empty space, and then the filter media, because everything comes in and fills that empty space.
And the
And so
filter-
that's what gets filled with garbage.
Okay, and the filter media is basically sand?
Sand and gravel.
Yeah.
Yeah, from when I remember doing it 5 years ago, I didn't actually see them get to the sand. I saw them they had gravel on top.
I gotta tell you, it was really, really beneficial when we have to make decisions on something and spending this kind of money, is that we got to see the lift station. So when it kept coming back that you guys needed to improve the lift station. We got to see it, we got to understand it, we got to make a great decision because we understood. And we're trusting you guys to tell us, you know, why this is so important to do it now versus waiting in 5 years or 6 years, and then we have to redo the whole thing. And I understand that you can't even lift up the lid right now because it's all rusted on the handle.
Yeah, they don't even have like what I would call handles. They have basically a piece of rebar that's just a little bit up, that they're just no good anymore.
And it's a concrete lid, right?
It's concrete. They're very heavy.
And we were talking about switching it to metal lid.
And it could be that I think we were looking at the possibility of some steel lids too, but which are easier to maneuver.
Lighter weight, et cetera.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions from council? Go ahead.
Melissa Gonzalez, 26 Reese. From my time on Public Works, I noticed that we used to have an engineering firm that had dedicated water people on it. And I don't think that Freeland Brook has a dedicated water person. Is that correct?
So this isn't, I mean, the majority of the cost of this is a structural engineer. And even Miller Gray, they didn't have structural engineers that they would also subcontract for structural.
It's
So
okay.
I would say that Gary Freeland does work in the water and floodplain and all of that. So he is there.
Well, I would just say that I think that when we come back a second time on a project where someone didn't have that the first time that we went through, that perhaps having a slightly larger firm would be a thing to consider so that we had more people who specialized in more things. And that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, other questions for staff on this item? Councilor Rosengarten?
I still have the old document with the first paragraph, which has no relevance to the rest of it. Yeah, and so I'm trying to, there, okay. I move to approve the amendment to Freeland Turk Task Order number 20. Am I not on? Closer? Okay. I move to approve an amendment to Freeland Turk Task Order number 26 for the Brody Lane Filter Box Modification Project.
Okay, there's a motion to approve. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any further discussion? Councilmember Johnson?
I've read 3 above, and for some reason in my mind there was 5. Where are the other 2?
North and
So there's the 3 that are really close to the intersection of Brody and Ernest Robles Way.
Yeah.
There's one further south, and there's one further north. So there's 5 total.
You have them laid out on the map up there. There you go.
Yeah. So there's 3 that like are very easy to spot because they're really close together.
Yeah.
And so it's 2 and 3 that we'd have the equalizer pipe through, and then the other 2 at the ends are just kind of they're totally separate.
All right, cool. That was it.
Next time you drive down Brody, you'll be like, oh, there it is.
Well, no, I know where 3 of them are, but like the other 2, it's just like, all right.
One that's dropped down on Brody, it's in the turn lane, so it doesn't look quite the same as the others.
Any further discussion, Council? All right. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, motion passed. We are going to move on to agenda number 6, which is public hearing and possible action on proposed amendment to section 150.106 of the Land Development Code relating to wildlife and child-friendly fencing. I'm going to go ahead and open the public hearing at 6:33. And council, as a reminder, during the public hearing, we'll be taking questions and allowing the public to speak. We will close the public hearing before we have any motions and return to this agenda item for any possible action. So with that, I'll open the public hearing, and we can begin with a overview from staff and address any council questions, and then we'll open up for the public.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. So this is a recommendation from the Planning and Environmental Committee. And basically, it is a change to the zoning chapter that including fencing as a accessory use on property, and also limiting the use of certain fencing materials and designs to make them more friendly for wildlife and for children. It does clarify that it's an accessory use, and some of those hazardous elements include spikes at the top and extensions beyond the horizontal top rail. They've been associated with children dying, as close as I think it was either Georgetown or Round Rock, because they're close enough just for small necks to get in between them, and it's not a good thing. And we have definitely had the issues here where they entangle wildlife, and we see them hanging on fences. So this would apply to new fences and to an existing fence if more than 50% of that fence is replaced. And so there is a date in there where we would put in that, it applies to fences after the date that council adopts. And then, sorry, jumped all the way down. This is similar to what is seen in the city of Austin, has recently passed a lot of this code to just codify these things to make things safer for wildlife and for children. And I'm going to pass it over to Jerry real quick.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Jerry Rusthoven. I do think that this is a positive amendment. In addition to the family-friendly and wildlife-friendly sections of it, it does have more clarification, which our code is silent on right now with regard to how the height of a fence is measured, and in fact adds a limitation on the height. Right now, in the code, the only limitation we have is a requirement that a fence above 7 feet requires a building permit, but it does not have a maximum height. And so if you adopt this amendment, it incorporates, as Carolyn said, basically the City of Austin's fence regulations with the additions of the amendments they recently made with regard to children and wildlife. I would ask, however, that we do one additional amendment, which is not in front of you right now, and that would be to strike section of the code 150.400, which is titled exemptions. It's actually the building permit section of the code. And that sentence reads right now that 150.400B, fences over 7 feet high that do not obstruct the flow of stormwater. So what this says is that basically any fence under 7 feet does not require a building permit, and that any fence above 7 feet does require a building permit. My recommendation would be that we take the requirement for a building permit for a fence, just strike that portion of the code and go with all the language that we would adopt that's in front of you right now here, because it is so specific about what you can and cannot do with a fence. So I don't see a need, I don't know of any other city that requires a building permit for a simple simple picket fence.
I'm sorry.
Councilor Isengard?
Thank you, I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you were saying.
So right now the code requires, right now the only part of the code that addresses a standard fence, what we think of as a fence, not a silt fence, not issues regarding drainage, but just a fence, is section 140.400, which talks about what does and does not need a building permit.
Okay.
So right now the only thing the code says is that basically a fence that's under 7 feet does not require a building permit, which by default means a fence above 7 feet does need a building permit. That's all our code addresses on fences. With this amendment that's before you today, we would add a lot of very specific requirements to fences about when one could be 6 feet, when one could be 8 feet, prohibition of spikes, et cetera, et cetera. So I would ask that we strike this section of the building section of the code that requires a building permit for a fence and just strike that sentence entirely and just rely upon the code language that you're adopting this evening and not require a building permit for a fence. Because again, I don't even know what we would review for a fence. There's not a need for a building permit to put up a fence, in my opinion.
So just a quick question on, as a follow-up, would that have to come back as a separate agenda item, or is that something that, because it's not part of the LDC, that we could, it wouldn't have to go through zoning?
Well, it is a part of the land development code. It would be a land development code amendment. I told Darren he didn't need to attend tonight. We could, call him real quick. Jerry thinks it doesn't. I mean, it also would not go to zoning because it's not in the zoning section.
Okay.
Yeah, and looking at the posting language, discussed fencing requirements, and so it's my opinion that that's broad enough to include this. This is a procedural issue as opposed to a code requirement.
Councilor Rosengren?
I brought it to city administrator's attention that on the cover page, it calls a fence a structure, an accessory structure, and of course, if it's called an accessory structure, then it also says that we're limited to 3 accessory structures on our property. And he said that, no, that's a typo, that should be accessory use. Of course, getting definitions is what was my next goal. And it says fences may be regulated as encroachments or necessary structures depending on their design or purpose. So it can be a structure. I'm sure it's probably a fence that is built as a brick wall is more of a structure. Otherwise, a fence is usually just, I don't know, in real estate, we don't even call it accessory use. We just call it a fence. It's on the property. But it's for tonight's purpose, it is called an accessory use, not an accessory structure, in case no one else got that. Thank you for your time.
Can you bring up the section of the code that's recommended for council to consider for striking?
Yes. So, yeah, it's 150.400B. Fences not over 7 feet high that do not obstruct the flow of stormwater. What that's saying is any fence under 7 feet does not require a building permit. So Development Services Manager's recommendation is just strike that, meaning we do not need building permits for fences, and that essentially this new section of the code would define what can and can't be built as far as fencing. I believe also, so the height for non-ornamental fences, there's height limits, but there's not a height limit for an ornamental fence, but I don't know if people are building really tall ornamental fences or not, if we need to address that.
Yeah, if the council wishes, they could add that to the section, but for a through fence would not require that.
Councilor Johnson?
So are you just coming up with this, not coming up with this right now, but is this the first time anyone's hearing about removing that?
Yes, we were originally thinking about adding this to this section, but we thought it'd be a better idea to put it over in this other section of the code, right, to address this use as opposed to building permits. However, I did just realize tonight that as long as we have very specific requirements we're adopting regarding fences, I don't see a need to require a building permit for every person who puts up or replaces a fence. There's just, the idea of a permit is to review for health, safety, welfare. electric permits, plumbing permits, things like that, structural permits, but, for a fence, it would still have to meet the code requirements, of course, and if someone
Yeah.
didn't, we would deal with it. But making someone pull a building permit just to put up a, replace their fence, I think is overkill, in my opinion.
If no other committee has like looked at it, I know I'd probably want to sit with it a little bit longer. I don't want to just like pull things out of other sections of the code without kind of like stewing on it for a little bit. So I know that's annoying, but it's the way I feel about it.
Councilmember Burrow.
If I could look at 150.400B, just to make sure I understand this. This says that a fence that's not over 7 feet, that does not obstruct the flow of stormwater, according to this, as I read it, it says that it presently is exempt from the requirement for a building code, and removing it seems that it would remove that exemption, and it perhaps would require a building permit. So am I reading this incorrectly, or?
No, to a degree, yes. You're reading it correctly, but, this lays out, these things need a building permit, except these things are accepted. And so it says a fence basically under 7 feet does not need one. By default, a fence over 7 feet does need one. I think that if we just strike it entirely, we would not require a permit for any fence because it doesn't talk about what's exempt, what's not. And it would be my interpretation that a fence does not require a building permit because it's not, to Councilmember Rosengarten's point, it's not a structure. It's a thing, but it's not a structure as in a building.
Yeah, so your concern is not with fences that are shorter, it's with all fences.
Yeah, I think if someone hypothetically, with this amendment, could come in with an 8-foot fence, if they met these certain criteria, right? And so I would not want a person who was building an 8-foot fence to comply with the code to be required to come in and get a building permit simply because their fence was, between higher than 7 feet. I mean, that would be silly in my opinion.
And just to also follow up on what you said, that nowhere else in this section does it especially call out fences as structures. And that would trigger what Councilmember Burrell's point where a fence, if we remove that, a fence would require, all fences are building permits because it's calling them accessory units, essentially.
It's an accessory use.
Accessory use. Sorry.
And also this establishes a maximum height for fence, which doesn't exist anywhere in the code right now. So there's like no maximum height on fence, and I think you do want a maximum height. So you don't want to just have incredibly tall fences in your residential areas.
Mayor Pro Tem and then Councilmember Rosengarten.
Okay, I have a naive question. I may be misunderstanding. With this amendment, no one needs a building permit to build a fence. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
Which is great. I think that, it's good to remove bureaucracy that isn't needed. But if someone's going to build a fence, how do they know what these rules are?
It would be the obligation of either the contractor or the homeowner to know what the code is, and I think that's, you can say that about everything when it comes to constructing something. Honestly, these rules would match Austin's rules, so chances are very good a fence contractor who works here would also work in Austin and would know to comply with the standard set of rules. I believe the system we have right now, which says basically anything under 7 feet doesn't need a permit, anything over 8 feet does, and that's it. They could build a 20-foot fence as long as they got a building permit. I would not be able to deny the building permit because we don't have a height limit. So I think that this here, I know that we try not to be Austin sometimes, but adopting Austin's standards here, including the wildlife and child-friendly aspects of them, would basically make it easier for people who are hiring a contractor. They would know simply to follow the rules that they're used to following anyway.
Here's another naive question, though. What if they don't follow the rules and they build a fence?
If they don't follow the rules and they build, let's say, a 12-foot fence, then it would be a code violation. And like if someone constructed a building without a permit or did a room addition without a permit, we would contact them, issue a stop work order if they were in the middle of building it, and talk to them about how to bring it into compliance. It has happened here before.
Okay.
Rosengarten?
2 questions. The first one is, does anybody remember the fence height of the Leona Garden to Table restaurant?
It's 10 feet.
I believe the condition was a 10-foot security fence along the
Between
back.
the residential and
Well,
commercial.
they need, it was a 10-foot height along the rear of the property, but the requirement was also a security fence around the entire property. So that's why there's a fence along the sides as well.
And any fence built taller than 8 feet at this time is grandfathered.
Correct, it would be grandfathered. It was also a condition of the zoning change, so it was, you know, set by city council. And additionally, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are for the height limit is for residential properties?
Actually, council, this amendment would apply to all properties, but I think that's okay because with the 8-foot height requirement, that typically is the maximum that you would allow, you know, even for a commercial property, and that would be allowed in this amendment. The 10-foot fence in the on the Leona property, that would be a different issue if the council, you know, wanted to do that again. I think that we'd have to go through a slightly different process to allow that.
But with this amendment, it would be grandfathered in because that
Yes.
fence was constructed.
Yes. No one's having to cut down a fence because of this amendment.
Thank you.
Other questions from council? Councilor Burrell?
I have a question. Looking at the proposal, the zoning commission voted to approve the proposed amendment with the caveat that they recommended removing section 12E4 from the on the related to historic design standards. Is this what we're considering, including that presently, or has that already been removed?
That section has been removed. It was
It was added inadvertently.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So council, just to summarize, we have the revised or the recommended version of the zoning change and the LDC amendment. And it includes the changes that it's calling it accessory uses instead of accessory
Well,
structures.
that was just a correction to the cover page.
That was the
Cover-
presentation there,
just
okay.
to the cover page, yeah.
And then staff has an additional recommendation to strike 150-400B, which would, you know, essentially remove the building permit requirement for fences because we would have this additional language that fences would have to comply with, otherwise they are they trigger code violation. And so we can either consider one or both, you know, as part of a motion, or if council wants to bring that second item back as a future agenda item, we can do that as well based on staff recommendation. Councilmember Medicus.
Was that 150-400E or B as in boy? Gotcha, thank you.
Councilmember Johnson.
Oh, I lost it. Great, hold on a second.
Sorry. We have to close the public hearing after I open up our.
Right.
I almost did the same thing. All right, so now the council's had an overview of the item and asked questions. We'll open it up for public comments as part of the public hearing. All right, I'm going to, at this time, close the public hearing at 6:50 p.m. And council, now that brings us back to our agenda item for possible action. Councilmember Johnson.
I move we amend section 150.106 of the Land Development Code relating to wildlife and child-friendly fencing, and bring back at a later date, striking 150.400B of the Land Development Code? No? Land Development Code, all right.
I'd recommend just making that a time certain, just so we have that on our agenda, like at the next council meeting. is
The
probably-
next meeting, I just.
Well, did you
Yeah,
vote here for that change?
Councilmember, if you don't want to do this right now, my request would be that we put this off until the code rewrite, because I think that what we'd have to do is I'd have to mail out a notice to every person in the city. I'd have to have a zoning commission meeting, and I'd have to bring it back to council just to address that one single issue. And to me,
It's, I mean, it's been in there. I don't like making like just striking decisions. I know, I'm sorry.
That's okay, I understand, but I would also prefer not to do this as a standalone code amendment because it is such a minor issue. So either we leave it alone or we get rid of it tonight. That'd be my preference.
All right. Okay. So just the first part.
Got it.
Okay. So the motion is to approve the amendments to section 150.106 of the Land Development Code. Is there a second for that? Councilmember Bell seconds. That opens it up for further discussion.
So just a point of clarification, this is without including 140.200 section B. That would come back
Yes,
later.
it's not striking section 150.400B.
The motion is just to adopt this code amendment relating to 150.106, adding section 12.
Councilmember Johnson.
If we want to do it, then I'm more than happy to just talk about it more. I'm trying to read this, and I'm a programmer, and I cannot read like legal documents to save my life. They're just like written such a, but like, talk to me like I'm a child and tell me why we're removing it.
Councilmember Medicus.
So I would offer an amendment to also strike 150.400B because the language that we're adopting would address the issue that we're talking about with height, from my understanding. Is that correct?
I think,
Yes.
And, okay, so maybe I do get that. Maybe it's more philosophically about just like striking another section of the Land Development Code, just like while we're at it.
I would either have us include it or move this to another meeting, rather than going through the whole process again.
Let's just do it.
Philosophically, how do you feel about when we're changing one thing over here, we then also strike something else, even though it's completely logical? You know, just like, oh, by the way, we also removed something from the Land Development Code.
I mean,
Like,
if we have significant questions about adding that in, then yes, we should move it to a future meeting. But my personal preference is we don't go through it twice.
how do you feel about removing it? Or just, how do you feel with just taking something out of the Land Development
I
Code?
agree with Councilmember Medicus. I think that it's straightforward enough that we can include it in without us falling into any pitfalls about the language of it. I think it seems simple and straightforward enough to me, although again, I am not a lawyer or an expert on zoning.
Yeah.
So I'd request, because we do have a clean motion, that if council wants to proceed with including this as an option, that we vote on this to determine if we go forward with it or not, and if not, then it would be a new motion to include that, rather than trying to make amendments at this time. I prefer that process, so if it gets voted down, then we can start with a new motion that would include the striking. If it gets approved, then we would just.
My motion was just the first half. You had a friendly amendment, and I just say, sorry, no. No, it's
Well,
just
we vote on yours, or
right,
then
okay,
there's another motion.
yeah, so,
Further discussion, council? Okay, so just to be clear, what we're voting on is the approval of the amendment to section 150.106 of the Land Development Code relating to wildlife and child-friendly fencing, and no other changes to the Land Development Code. And staff recommends an additional change, which is not part of this current motion. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
right?
All opposed, say nay.
No.
Nay.
Nay.
All right, so that motion fails. That opens up for additional motions at this time. Councilor Medicus?
Make a motion to approve the proposed amendment to section 150.106 of the Land Development Code relating to wildlife and child-friendly fencing, and also 150.400B, the Land Development Code.
So striking 150.400B from.
Yes, removal of it, yes, striking.
So is there a second for that motion? Councilor Burrell seconds. All right, that opens up for further discussion. Councilor Rosengard?
Would you show 150.400 again?
the highlighted text would be struck from the land development code. And then these would be
Any fence not over 7 feet does not obstruct the flow, and that does not obstruct the flow of stormwater, is exempt from a permit. So why do we want to?
Because Councilmember, one, I don't believe a fence should need a building permit. And two, you could come in to build a fence that was under this new code amendment here between 7 and 8 feet. It would still require, if we left this section in, it would still require there to be a building permit. So you'd have this weird universe of fences that are between 7 and 8 feet that would need a building permit, and then a fence 6 feet or below would not need, 7 feet or below would not need a building permit, and I don't find that to be logical.
So, hold on.
Correct.
Got it, okay.
Councilor Johnson?
So my problem kind of remains is there is one thing that we came to like deliberate on and talk about.
Yeah.
And then the staff recommendation is to approve the amendment and then also talk about the height limit for fences. And then in this meeting, oh, also we want to do this over here. And I don't know, that just, see, I totally get it and it makes sense, but like, I think one day that could come back and kind of bite you. And I'm totally in favor of it, but I think it's just like a bad precedent to edit somewhere else in the document when it's like not even, if it was like in the staff recommendation to say, oh, also we're going to strike B of 150.400, then I'd be like, sure, cool. But, all right.
Councilor Maticus?
It's my understanding that 150.400B is already addressed by the amendment for 150.106. It would be more consistent across the board. I don't see that we're talking about fencing and safety, and if, you know, you have permits here and no permits there, it just cleans it up. I don't have a philosophical problem with that, personally.
Other discussion? Councilor Rosengard?
I understand what you're saying, Councilmember Johnson. A lot of times there are rewrites in financial policies, for instance, and the items that we're discussing for the evening are in red and shown what has been changed. And if something else, because I've done this, something else in there, you find, hey, this word, the way this sentence is needs to be wordsmithed. It doesn't read well. We need to change it. Well, then we needed to bring it back. So we only were allowed to discuss and to approve what was in front of us for the agenda for that night, and we had to bring it back to make other changes. So I understand where you're going with this. And then the next time, there's something like this. Staff will recommend something, and it correlates with what's on the agenda, and we're told that it's fine to go ahead and do it. So
I'd also just state that I've seen council redline the red lines live during council meetings, which this is kind of a similar thing, but it's coming from staff recommendation versus council recommendation. So I think that's been something that's you know, difficult to work through as well. But in this case, it's, you know, if we don't approve this, staff recommendation is to bring this back as part of the land development code, not go through another public hearing, which would trigger, especially for such a small change. So if council's not comfortable with making a change, then this would be part of our land development code rewrite, and there would be this kind of situation where people building between a 7 and 8 foot fence, they would have to get a building permit, even with the new language that dictates what types of fence can be built per the code. I don't know how frequent that is, but you know, that's just what would happen as far as not striking this. Mayor Pro Tem?
My problem with not taking this out is then we have two things that contradict each other. And I think, while I agree with you in most cases, Councilman Johnson, that we shouldn't, staff shouldn't just come in and make changes on the fly. In most cases, but this is small enough and simple enough, and it removes the contradiction from what we want to approve. So in this particular case, not in every case, I'm okay with staff coming and saying we should take this out, even though it wasn't part of the agenda.
Any further discussion? All right, we'll see how this turns out. All those in favor of approving the amendment to section 150.106 of the Land Development Code and striking section 150.400B, fences not over 7 feet high that do not obstruct the flow of stormwater, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay.
Nay.
All right, the motion passes. All right. All right, so council, that brings us to our last item for tonight, which is a discussion-only item. If council wishes to take further action on this, it would be brought back in a future item for possible action. Presentation, discussion, and possible staff direction on an ordinance amendment, on ordinance amendments related to proposed realignment of advisory committees and commissions and creation of a community engagement team. And I'll hand this over to staff for an overview. And this is something that council, as you may remember, I'm sure the city administrator will remind us, was discussed 4 years ago now at one of our council retreats with a joint meeting between the council and some of the chairs and vice chairs of the committees or delegates that they were sent. And then we discussed it again during our last retreat and started a process for review, and this is where we're at.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. So yes, as the Mayor said, this is we've been discussing this for a couple years now, and we discussed a path forward at our last council retreat. This item was brought to you in March with some ideas, and then the charge was to go discuss the ideas with the affected committees. We also passed, I believe in April or even back in March, we did make some amendments to Chapter 31 relating to quarterly reporting. So we struck the codification of the committees having to send quarterly reports to council, and now we've incorporated committee reports as part of staff reports. So those are the changes we have made. These are the proposed changes. So we have received feedback. So the CED committee, they were totally fine with, and they understood the economic development not really working in the hands of an advisory committee, and also just all of the unique things about Sunset Valley. However, the committee was concerned with, and you know, several residents spoke to me and spoke to the mayor about continuation of city events, events that have been going on for quite a few years now, like Spring Fling, which was always anchored by the CED committee and also supported by staff as well. But then any ideas for, you know, future events. So the committee, you know, the CED committee met in March and discussed, you know, brainstormed what could we do to make sure that we have events and have community engagement, but not necessarily work within the, you know, confines of a standard advisory committee that has to meet every so often, has to post an agenda, has to keep minutes. So the committee and staff came up with creating a team. I believe I originally called it a working group. The CED committee didn't like that title, so we came up with team. So the idea is to call it the community engagement team. You know, feel free to give any feedback if you would like it called something different. Essentially, yeah, transitioning from a formal standing committee to a more flexible working group focused on community engagement and collaboration with other committees. I think an important part of that is making sure that there is alignment and that all of the committees that are involved with events make sure they know the bandwidth, right? We happen to have a lot of events that always happen in the spring. And I think a lot of that happens, I mean, spring is really nice weather, but also the committees get seated, right? It takes a couple of months sometimes to get things going, and then all of the events end up happening in the spring. And we have, that's when our Art Fest is, it's when Spring Fling happens, and then, we have Public Works Open House. So it just seems like there's so many events that happen at once. So I think if we have this team that is meeting in the summer to kind of propose a draft calendar, we can hopefully spread those events out more. But I think it's also important to have staff as a part of this team, because staff is providing a lot of the logistical support, and we need to make sure that there's also budgetary oversight too. So the proposed code language addresses those items. So that's sort of what's happening with the CED transition. The CED committee would go away, but be replaced with a community engagement team made up of representatives of P&E, possibly Parks and Environmental, the Arts Commission, additional residents, and then 3 staff members, the communications and engagement coordinator, and then 1 representative from Public Works, 1 representative from the police department. So as far as the P&E committee, currently planning and environmental, the committee discussed the proposed changes at a meeting in March and also in April. The committee discussed renaming and refocusing their scope. At the April 14th meeting, the committee formally recommended renaming itself to the Parks and Environmental Committee and adopting the following purpose statement. The P&E committee makes recommendations to the City Council regarding environmental issues and programs, the planning and development and management of the city's public parks, green spaces, and conservation lands. This includes vegetation, restoration, wildlife, trails, and recommendations to council for green space acquisitions to expand and refine the trail links and neighborhood buffers. And then additionally, the last advisory body we spoke to was the Zoning Commission on May 7th. We presented the proposal to expand the Zoning Commission scope to include planning responsibilities, which would form a planning and zoning commission. And the commission members expressed general support with no objections. So next steps, the CED committee is meeting tomorrow night. We will be discussing the proposed code language that's in the backup, creating that community engagement team. So they'll be able to provide some feedback. Additionally, the hope is to bring this back the next council meeting to adopt the changes and also to seat members of the team. So I believe the Arts Commission and the P&E committee have already selected 2 volunteers from each to establish the team and start working on the events and the budget, the necessary budget request for FY26. We would not bring back the changes to the Land Development Code, specifically section 150.030, because that again requires, changing that code requires a public hearing and notice to be sent out to all residents. But if we bring back just the Chapter 31 amendments, we could also bring back, or council could charge staff with proceeding with the Land Development Code amendment to change zoning to a Planning and Zoning Commission, if the council so chooses. So really tonight looking for council feedback of the proposed code changes. Again, we're going to be talking with CED about it tomorrow night. So yeah, just looking for any feedback so we can hopefully bring back a clean red lines and on June 3rd.
It opens up for council discussion or questions for staff as a follow-up. And again, we're not taking action tonight. This is providing staff direction and possible follow-up with additional meeting agenda item on June 3rd. Councilmember Rosinger?
Just one of the public comments tonight made it sound like the committees haven't heard this and haven't reviewed it and haven't come up with decisions, and yet it's in our backup that they have reviewed it and they have come up with recommendations themselves. And so I don't understand where those comments came from. Parks and Environmental, I think, because previously we had discussions, and I know I introduced some ideas, and Parks and Environmental won over my idea, and it sounds fine. That's what they do. Now, you still have the word planning in there, and so they're planning, development, and management. So what part of the planning that they used to do is going to zoning?
It would be just general city planning, so comprehensive planning.
Okay, big
Right,
picture.
because planning is more than just planning for parks, green spaces, and conservation lands. There's, planning is for, the entire city, all zoning districts of the city, so. But I think the point of keeping planning, development, and management of city public parks, green spaces, and conservation lands is, that's already what the P&E committee is doing. And most of their, their focus has been, even when they were the, P&E committee, the planning was generally focused on those areas of the city, not the commercial areas. And anything that does relate to the environment that is related to code, for example, wildlife safety fencing, that would still be discussed at the Parks and Environmental Committee. The water conservation rebates, that would still be discussed at the Parks and Environmental Committee because that is part of its charge. Environmental issues and programs, so.
Yeah, and I was just reflecting on the wildlife fencing because I think it would work exactly the same, that P&E would be discussing that and they would be making a recommendation to council, and then council initiates a zoning review or possible change as a result of that. Would that be essentially the process that would?
You're correct, Mayor. So again, if the committee came up with something, like they did in this case, they would pass a resolution asking you to initiate an amendment. You would initiate the amendment. We bring it back to them for refinement. Then we take it to the Planning and Zoning Commission just as we would today because it's a code amendment, and then we take it back to council. So in that particular instance, I don't think it would change who it went to.
Let's go with, I don't know whose hand was first, Councilor Medicus, and then Mayor Pro Tem, and then we'll go back to Councilor Rosengart.
So can you go, Matt, to the proposed language from P&E on the change?
And this incorporates the motion that was made at the April meeting.
Oh, I see. I'm trying to see that far.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. So there was considerable discussion about this at the Planning and Environmental Committee, and they came to the recommendation, as long as the planning part was in the language for the purpose, that's when they voted. So it was back and forth, and some people wanted to keep planning in there, some people didn't, but the language seemed to address those issues that related to planning in the meeting, and that's why the motion was made to change the name to that.
Mayor Pro Tem.
I had some doubts about this, but it did go through all the committees. They did review it. They did approve it. I just want to make sure that we don't consider planning solely the province of zoning and planning, right? I still think there needs to be the opportunity for feedback from the other committees because they have points of view that I think are important in the entire planning process. That's kind of my concern about this. But as long as there's a place for feedback from those other committees, I'm okay with it.
Councilor Rosengart.
The last sentence of number 4, council, recommendations to city council green space acquisition to expand and refine the trail links and neighborhood buffers. What has happened in the past is usually the owner of a piece of land would come before council and we would meet in executive session. We wouldn't have a committee bringing it to us.
This was language from, again, this wasn't codified, but this was created. It's probably been around for many, many years. But yeah, I mean, this is.
So then, continuing with that sentence, so then if there is a landowner who comes before
Right.
council, do we then have to kick it to Parks and Environmental?
You do not have to, no. This is just, again, this is saying the committee can make recommendations, or one of its purposes is to make recommendations for green space acquisitions. But again, ultimately, any sort of land acquisition is, this is just an advisory body. You all are the legislative body that takes action.
Councilor Brown?
Do we have a similar statement for a current or proposed statement for zoning or planning and zoning? Can we see that?
We do. And I believe we need to make some additional changes. The city attorney was recommending some additional changes, but again, this would not be coming back at the June 3rd meeting because, again, it requires a public hearing, notice sent out to residents, and it has to go to the zoning commission first. So, but this is just kind of the rough draft of the language.
So the public hearing is required because we're changing the name of the zoning committee to planning and zoning, or are there other
The public hearing is required because we were making changes to the land development code and to the zoning section of the land development code. So zoning's got to hear it, so.
Thank you.
Councilor Johnson?
It's a strange question, but things are usually brought to the zoning commission, and they've obviously ran through this, but do they know that now they can begin to start? Like, does zoning doesn't have a standing meeting every month or quarter?
They do not, no. They meet as needed. Generally, if it's just they have a zoning case, or if there is some sort of proposed amendment or issue.
Do they start to change? Because it's more of it's not just like a review body anymore now, it's more like.
I think, Councilmember, if I could, when I'm discussing this with them the other night, I think that they understood that to a degree, their purview is going to expand. We did not talk about specifically a meeting frequency. I would anticipate that they'd be meeting more often.
Yeah.
I think that we probably have to have a discussion with them and maybe through some trial and error figure out what the frequency of that would be. I don't think it would necessarily be monthly at this point, but maybe something like quarterly or something, but we would discuss that with them.
Yeah, it's a strange one because all the other committees are required to have a meeting once a quarter. Like public safety, it's like we'll have one if we need to, but usually we just do it once a quarter. And we don't want zoning we don't want to be right back to where we were with 6 committees again. But it is kind of interesting that they can start kind of producing work now for the city to do.
Councilor Medicus?
So, just so I understand the process, the zoning commission would have to have a public hearing. Do the other changes need to have a public hearing, or can we look at those to come back on the June 3rd, potentially on the consent agenda?
Chapter 30? Or chapter 31?
The changes other than the zoning.
So adding this section, 31.40, the community engagement team, and these changes here, the purpose statements, do not require a notice of public hearing with mail-outs. I mean, every council meeting is essentially a public,
right.
But yes, this could go on the consent agenda. It does not need to go before any other body.
Because it's my understanding if we do the community engagement, they are tentatively looking at getting that group together mid-July so that they can look at the budgets and calendarize events?
I mean, ideally, we want them to meet mid-June because the Budget and Finance Committee reviews committee and event requests at the June, I think it's the last Thursday in June. So we're looking for a mid-June meeting.
Because I think it would be I'm really excited about that because over the years in working with committees that do events, there have been events that conflicted and one hand didn't know what the other hand was doing. We talked about this at our joint meeting years ago, but it would be really great to be able to look at our events and get some placeholders throughout the year so that we're not bumping into each other. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I'd like to see us, move forward with that sooner rather than later.
Mayor Pro Tem.
So, in terms of the planning process, once we move this to the zoning commission, how would things like, for example, we want to make changes to the comprehensive plan? Do we have an idea of how that would work?
Right now, there is a schedule for the revision of the comprehensive plan. I believe the year was 2030 something.
Yeah.
But it's anticipated that aside from something that may come up, and it may, who knows, The next major project would, of course, be the code rewrite, but as we discussed both in the zoning commission as well as at the PUC committee, I think that that is something that we will be discussing with the city council prior to engaging upon that, so that the council would actually endorse a public engagement process. It would probably involve a separate committee composed of members of multiple city committees as well as general citizens. So I anticipate that being the next major project. But I would think there are some things that may come up with regard to code amendments that may not necessarily we want to wait for a whole entire code rewrite, or just an issue that we have not imagined yet. There are things that people bring forward. People call me about things there was a call this week about, what about this? Well, sorry, that's, we've never considered that. That's not allowed here, blah, blah. So maybe that we use it as a sounding board for those kind of ideas. But the big one's a code rewrite, but otherwise it would just be general planning things. In other cities, there are more delegated authorities from the city council to a zoning and planning commission. So they handle all subdivisions, for instance. Usually there's a greater volume of zoning cases than what we have here. So they do have more to do, if you will, sometimes in other cities, but here the council keeps more of that to themselves. But I do see them handling general city planning issues as they come up from time to time.
Okay.
Councilor McGraw.
So if I support, I think, everything that's happening here, but just so I understand it, it appears to me that if we pass Section 31 at the June 3rd meeting, and then hold for a series of public hearings for the changes that would affect zoning, that for that interim period, there effectively would be no home for planning, which maybe is not a showstopper, but that seems to be the case.
Planning would take the summer off.
Yeah, we could take.
Canada in June, by the way.
And I do think this is, I think this is an ideal time to do it because we revised our comprehensive plan in 2023. So, we hopefully don't need to touch the comprehensive plan for a while. But as Development Services Manager said, yes, there's a code rewrite looming, but that's a much larger discussion that begins here with you all and deciding what is the public engagement process. Are we going to have an ad hoc committee? Probably, and so we'll start those discussions here, but then of course involve any of the relevant committees, commissions.
And I don't think it doesn't put a halt to planning, because we would still have bodies like the proposed parks and environmental to be able to discuss planning as it pertains to these and make a recommendation to council, which might initiate a meeting, at zoning in the interim. But
so there are aspects of planning.
Yeah. It's just that I think that until zoning is codified as the planning body, then staff, wouldn't have like a body that would be in charge of that. But I think that's.
There's even a place in the code where it refers to the Planning and Zoning Commission. I'm sure where we copied the code from somebody else and forgot to take up.
There are other sites, if I could, just real quick. This addresses kind of the general, I can't remember what it's called, but organization, rules, powers and duties of the commission. There are other sections of the code that say this thing needs to go to the zoning commission. So, we already bring special use permits to the zoning commission because the special use section says you got to bring them to the zoning. We would right now.
Councilor Johnson.
It may not come up, and that'd be great, but since zoning is like a fixed number of people, in the past, how have you kind of dealt with a lot of people that want to be on it? Like if some people are going to leave parks and environmental because they really love land development code stuff, which actually is probably going to be an ad hoc committee anyway, but like if that's what they were there for, and
I know there was one years ago, I believe it was 2020, right before the pandemic, and we had, I believe, 7 applicants to zoning. So 5 had to be appointed as regular members and 2 had to be appointed as alternates. And I believe it was, the most senior folks were regular members, and the newest applicants were determined as alternates, but you all appoint, so you all would.
Yeah, and this is a special situation because we're almost like rug pulling, so
But
it's
we,
just like,
but we
you
do
wanted to do
need,
this.
we do need alternates for zoning. We had a situation at the last, we only have 5 members. There was a situation at the last zoning hearing and one of the members couldn't be there, and so we only had 4. It was okay, but, you know, you need, and the code really emphasizes it too. You really do need alternates for both the Board of Adjustment and the.
And one reason for that, Commissioner, sorry, Councilmember, is not only to address the fact that, you know, people have cases before the, you know, maybe residents or possibly, you know, commercial business, so they've kind of gone through a process to get to that point, so it kind of hurts to show up and there not be a quorum. And secondly, the city puts an expense in mailing out notices, so, you know, we would like to keep the alternate system so that if someone can't make it, we can still have the hearing and won't have to spend the money re-notifying because somebody could unexpectedly not make it.
Yeah, and again, I don't see it happening, but maybe the next time we see zoning, if there is a bunch of people that left planning environmental P&E to go over, just weigh that in your decision who you seat, because these people, we pulled their home out from underneath them and whatever. Maybe we just pull names out of my hat.
They can always join council.
That's true.
Councilman Radicus.
Oh, I forgot what I was gonna say. Never mind. Oh, yes, sorry, zoning. So that's a 2-year appointment as opposed to the
Correct.
committees are 1-year appointments. So when are those appointments up?
So zoning is actually not up till next year, but the council could consider with these changes, you know, after the
Additional.
election, allowing, and we do, honestly, we do. We only have 5 members. We really do need some alternates. And I know there's one member of zoning commission who requested to be an alternate, and I said, no, you need to be a regular member so we can have a full commission, so.
Okay, so there's opportunity this
Yeah,
year.
so council could always make, you know, additional appointments at any time.
Gotcha, okay.
So council, what I'm taking away from this discussion is that there is continued interest in bringing this item back for consideration on June 3rd. You know, while I think you said we could list it on consent, I don't want to do that just because I want to give the public as much opportunity as possible to provide their feedback to council. So likely this will be something that we bring back, not as a consent item, but we bring back as a possible action for our June 3rd meeting. And noting that I don't think there were significant changes that were suggested, but City Administrator, did you want to?
Yes, I had a conversation with Councilmember Rosengarten. I don't know if we want to discuss this, and we'll talk about it more at CED tomorrow evening, but again, in trying to, you know, have participation, but you want to also have you know, parameters. You don't want a giant team. So the team right now, the way the language reads is 2 members of the P&E, 2 members of the Arts Commission, 3 resident volunteers who are not current members of either P&E or Arts, and then the 3 city staff members. And so Councilmember Rosengarten and I were discussing, you know, is it really good to have this, you know, clause here, limiting it? You know, what if 3 members of P&E, you know, want to make that up? So just an idea. I'll discuss it at CED tomorrow evening. But I think the idea is you want, you know, 7 residents, 3 staff. It's a good mix, but you don't want probably more than 7 residents, because if you have a giant team, consensus can be difficult to reach.
And what if there's 3 members of Parks and Environmental that want to be, and only 1 member of the Arts Commission?
Yeah, well, I think it's good to have, well, yeah. So, I mean,
So
I
that's
guess
where
you
I-
could change it to,
I mentioned at least.
yeah, you could
2
say
members.
7 residents with at least 1 member, and at least, but I think it's good to have 2. I don't know if there's any.
I prefer more flexible language just because I can envision that there may be, you know, times when we can't get, it's like trying to, you know, get people in here. So I think something that says, you know, the 7 residents.
7 residents with at least 1 member of the P&E committee, and at least
Arts
1,
Commission.
and at least 1. Okay.
Yeah, and then it's up to council to do the appointments, you know, gives us a little bit more flexibility.
Okay, I can bring that to CED and then. Oh, go.
Yeah, we can take public comments if you want to step up to the podium.
So that condition that you have that, you know, a resident cannot serve on more than 2 committees, so that might also come into play here.
Since this is not a committee, that wouldn't apply. So you could be, honestly, you could, if you're really, really want to get out there, you could be on 2 committees and be on the team, so.
Councilor Johnson?
Yeah, it's not a commission, so I don't know, you don't have to hit quorum, right? You don't have to do,
Exactly.
so I don't even know why we're putting any numbers at all on it, just if you want
I guess, you
to
know,
throw a party. get in
it
there.
could, yeah, it could be, but some structure, but yeah.
Yeah, I think, oh, go ahead.
I mean, we could, I mean, if we think we just don't want numbers and just say the team shall be composed of resident representatives with at least 1 member of P&E, 1 member of the Arts Commission, and then the 3 staff. We could just not have a number, because what if there is a year where 7 people
Yeah,
don't
I
want to
think
do it?
if you tell a group of people that they're gonna have money and staff support, and they get to plan events, like, sorry, Catherine is already thinking about leaving Planet Environmental just to go do this. Like, that's what she wants to do.
She wants to do this.
So.
It's more fun.
She's like, what? No point.
So this kind of sells itself. I think it's kind of funny that we're putting so many rules on like the fun team. But
There's not a lot of rules, come on.
So I have I have a question. So this is just an events team or a community engagement team. It's a team. Does council need to make appointments? Is this not a standing committee?
It does say that council will appoint. It says,
But we're just saying that. I mean, but it's
Right.
not a standing committee.
so yeah, if
So-
you don't want, if you don't want them to be appointed and just, it's just sort of,
I don't know.
I mean, I think that,
It's good to have a number.
yeah,
So we don't have
I think
30.
we just have to think of the situation where, what if there are 10 people that are interested, and is, you know, staff recommendation to keep it smaller, do we care, right? You know, I guess in terms of like, is it more the merrier because they're all participating, or is it, you know, do we want to put some constraints on it, and then if there are 10 people but we only have 7 spots, who makes the decision, right? Do we want to burden staff with making that choice, or do we want, you know, council to have to make that
Matt's
choice?
like, no. So does it need to be, if it's in this code, isn't this for, this section for standing committees? Or can,
it's a new section.
Oh, it's a
So
new
it's a
section,
new
okay.
section.
okay.
It lives under officials and organizations, but it would be a standalone. So it would be considered an organization, a city organization. So let me
Okay.
go
Just-
up here.
So it doesn't fall under all the other requirements for
No.
posting and minutes
And
and
it-
regular
correct,
meetings
correct.
and.
So it would live here, and I believe it would live under organizations at the end. So it would be after the zoning commission.
So I would think planning, I mean, a number to be able to make decisions is good, but when you're doing events, you're gonna want the more the merrier of volunteers to get involved and help, so.
Yeah, my preference would be that we have flexibility to make those, but council should ultimately be the ones, you know,
Yeah.
saying this is what we want for this year, because I think it's just helpful. We don't want to have staff put in that situation. But I don't think limiting it, hard coding it, you know, to 7 every year, there may be some benefit. Some years where we have significant interest and we say, you know, that's probably a good year to beef up the committee, or, you know, maybe there's some plans there.
So-
But I think what I'd like to have is the language that says, you know, it'll be composed of residents and representatives from arts and parks or P&E,
So-
as well as staff support.
So it would be, shall be composed of the following representative, you know, residents of the city, at least 1 member of P&E, at least 1 member of the Arts Commission, and then the 3 city staff members. So that it's not having a set number,
Yeah.
except for the staff, and just making sure that there's at least a representation from the 2, from P&E and Arts.
Councilor Brown?
Yeah, I guess the concern that I have, if we go with just at least one, is I think the intent of this committee is to be rather holistic in terms of looking at events for the city throughout the entire year. And if it's, for example, if we have at least one member from one committee, what's to prevent, you know, a committee just completely dominating this committee in terms of, you know, where it becomes, say, one-sided in favor of a particular activity?
Yeah, I think that because council appoints, we would have that opportunity to decide, you know, the makeup. And if there were a lot of people interested from one committee, we could, you know, say, well, we already have enough, you know, representation, so we're going to appoint, you know, these members. So that's a check, right, in terms of
So the check would be
council decision to weigh, you know, what is the best, you know, committee structure each year. Councilor Medigas?
So I believe when we looked at this, it was looking at the committees that are doing events, and these are the two committees that do events, but PD does events too. So should we have a representative?
The police department does events, but correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think Public Safety Committee generally is involved or makes recommendations on things like National Night Out. And that's pretty much just handled by
Chief
the police.
plans that entire thing
Yeah.
by himself, and then that guy right there also does a lot of.
So Public Safety Committee generally doesn't get involved in the event plan.
Right, but PD's involved, and like we
Right,
just
and
had the
that's why,
trail-
so that's why we have a police department representative.
Oh,
who
down
will be
there. I
sitting,
see, I see.
sitting right over there.
I know.
He will be on our,
Brownlow, we
And-
want you.
yeah. And I think,
Okay,
you know,
see it.
Carolyn's gonna join the team for now, but I think we want Zach to be the official. He's our,
Okay, I'm
Event
sorry, I
guy
didn't see
and
that,
training.
okay.
so yeah, there will be, a rep from each of the departments.
Did you say Zach?
Yeah.
From Public Works?
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Zach.
Oh, yeah. he's
I
great.
like Zach.
And he loves doing events and he does a great job, so.
Councilor Rowe?
Yeah, I think that as this evolves, that we should be careful to sort of just to keep a pulse on how this actually turns out, because it's foreseeable, hopefully not, but it's foreseeable to me that this committee or team could sort of turn into a meeting of the leaders of the Scottish clans, where everyone's coming with their vested interest, and it becomes, you know, sort of a shouting match to see who can scream the loudest, particularly if they're going to be making, you know, budget recommendations. So, you know, and I think, again, at least my vision is that this would be a group that would sort of be more congenial and not come in with, you know, with vested interests. But yet it's set up with people that obviously have, you know, things that are important to them, which I think we value as a city. So I think there's going to have to be some balance and some monitoring to see that, just to make sure that the city's best interest is really represented by these willing and capable volunteers.
You sound like someone who spent some time on academic committees or something.
I've been on plenty of these. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Councilor Medigas?
So, I mean, the onus is really going to be on staff to keep things balanced with resources, financial and human resources to produce events, I would think.
Well, the onus is, I think, on staff to manage the ideas and support them, and ultimately, that's going to come to council for budgetary approval, right? So we're the ultimate, again, you know, check on in this is that we are probably going to rely heavily on staff recommendation for what comes out of the committee, and it's not, because I think council is going to prefer doing that rather than having just an open-ended request, you know, process. So what I envision is that staff is collecting and coordinating the events for this calendar year. They're looking at their staffing requirements, the budgetary requirements, and then they are making a recommendation at the budget time that they agree with and approve, and they feel confident they can execute on. And then it's up to council to whether we feel that we can include that in our budget or not. And if we have concerns, then we either send it back to the team for, you know, addressing, or we make the decision at the time that we're adopting the budget. So. Are there discussion items regarding this agenda item?
So, just so when I take this back, or take this to CED tomorrow night, and then we bring it back, I'm sensing the consensus is not having a number, a number.
I don't want to designate a specific number, because I think that's where we got into some trouble before. I do want to make sure that there is language saying that it includes the representation from the two committees that do event planning. Right, and I don't even think we need to say, however, we can craft it such that it gives us some flexibility at the time of appointments. Yeah.
Sure.
And even if it's their language in there that it's recommended that it's included at least X number of people, right? I think that's helpful for future councils as well.
Okay.
Right. Like if we say it's recommended this includes a minimum of 5 residents with 1 representative.
With one, got it.
Councilor Medicus?
My eyes aren't that great, but am I missing that it doesn't say like former members of the CED committee? Or how do we make sure we get them included?
I mean, do you mean, you think the code language should address CED? Or just this first round, we want to invite members of the CED that want to join this team? I think they should be.
Because they're the committee that's being sunsetted.
Yes.
And they're a committee that does events, and so.
So yes, I will be looking for, we will be hopefully tomorrow evening, if they do make a formal recommendation to go with this, we'll be asking them, hey, please join the team, right?
Right.
Especially some of the more senior members who have
So
been
maybe something
involved.
about the transition year will include
Well,
volunteers? I don't know.
I don't know if we should. I don't know if we should codify that necessarily, but maybe in the backup, for when we bring this item back, it will say, and maybe the ordinance, the actual ordinance, the whereas, whereas the Community and Economic Development Committee supports this, and members of that committee will be transitioning to the team. So we'll need to capture that in the whereas.
Just somewhere. I don't want to leave them out.
Right. Thank you for that.
Mayor Pro Tem.
I was going to suggest that if council is approving the appointments to the committee, for those 3 resident volunteers, if there's more than 3 that want to be on it, we favor the people who were on CED before.
Yeah.
Well, I think too, we're not, I think the new language may not have a cap, right? I mean, again, we don't want a team of 15 people, but I think we want to, yes, welcome as many, like if the entire CED committee, well, one is also a member of P&E, but if the rest want to be on this team, I think you all will definitely want to appoint them.
Right. If we have, the good problem of having more than 7 people that want to be on it.
I think we could, yeah.
We should maybe, if we decide to cap the number of people on, we should favor the people who are on CED.
Yes, and because this doesn't have the quorum requirements, that's sometimes the struggle of a large standing committee is, if you have a large committee, you have a really.
I think what you're going to have is different people will be interested in different events, and out of those 7 people or whatever number we have, I think you're not going to have the same 7 people every time on every event.
Exactly. Councilor Dawson.
I'm sure they're going to be big kids that can figure it out, but what's the structure of the first meet? We'll just let them go, but having a chair, having one leader kind of really helps. Having an agenda, having Robert's Rules of Order or something, just a way to say, not to be silly about it, but it's like, okay, plan. What does that look like?
So staff's involved, and we have a communication and events coordinator on staff, and I would think that would be the person who would structure the meeting.
That was going to be my suggestion too. I think that's the obvious person to do that.
Yeah, and I think that structure is also defined by the purpose. I mean, the purpose of this is to plan the events for the upcoming year, doesn't allocate budget or secure budget and secure staff support. And so I think you're right, that the events coordinator needs to be the person who's, saying, here's how we get to that point, right?
Yeah.
But that was a good point to bring up, that we need someone doing that.
So it does say in the structure, city staff will coordinate meetings facilitate communication among members, and ensure the team's recommendations are reviewed and processed in accordance with city procedures. So
Any other-
staff is not chairing the meeting, but
Coordinating.
yeah.
Where does it say the meeting will take place at Total Wine?
City staff will coordinate.
Yeah.
Right, and facilitate communication among the members.
All right, any other discussion on this agenda item? All right, so council will be bringing this back on June 3rd for possible action. All right, we are out of agenda items.
Mayor,
Oh, Councilor
could I just mention, just briefly, that I don't see anything in the sort of the draft or the proposal that's being developed of who a chair would be. And I agree that staff shouldn't be running this meeting. So some consideration at some point on how the chair would be appointed or who the chair would be, or what that process is, probably would be worthwhile considering.
So we can include that as another discussion point for the June 3rd meeting, but that might be good to bring to tomorrow's discussion for the CED, just in terms of their thoughts on how this meeting can be coordinated and organized if they want more structure, or recommend more structure. Councilor Medicus.
Motion to adjourn.
All right, is there a second for that? Mayor Protem? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? We are adjourned at 7:49 PM. Thank you, council, thank you, staff, and thank you, members of the public.
We could have been done.